Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for joining us in what promises to be a wonderful discussion entitled Technology and Identity. I'm so honored to be here with you for the pre-WTA Biennial Online, and I'm so grateful to be in the company of all of you this morning. Thank you to all of the organizers who made this conversation possible. I'd also like to thank my panelists today for sharing their time and their work with us. Today, we have a special panel of speakers, and I'll briefly introduce you to them before they introduce themselves and talk a little bit more about their work. First, we have Sofie Overgaad, a visual artist currently practicing in Denmark. She studied at the Jutland Academy in Aarhus and the Bergen Academy of Art and Design in Bergen. Next, we have Lucía, a designer, researcher, and educator. She is a graduate of social psychology with a master's in fashion design and society and educational psychology, and she received her doctorate in public health. And finally, we have Victoria Manganiello, who is an artist, educator, and producer. She is a professor at Parsons, the New School of Design, and New York University. I'd love to give each of them the opportunity to introduce themselves and show a bit of their work. Sofie, would you like to start?
Yeah, hi, hello. Thank you for the presentation. My name is Sofie, and I'm from Denmark, and I studied at the Jutland Art Academy, and I finished in 2016, and I've been living here in Aarhus since then, and I have my studio here in the center of the city. And like the center of my practice is working with textiles and in particular weaving. And I also work with installation and digital graphics. And in my practice, I work a lot with exploring temporalities and narrative forms in connection with these physical materialities and more intangible digital processes. And in that connection, also, as you can see on the photo, I've been working a lot with digital weaving. And this connection, evolutionary connection between the Jacquard loom and the first computers and this binary system. So in a way, the digital weaving is kind of a natural way to translate these digital image into physical bodies. So I've been working a lot with that. And yes, and I also, as you can see, maybe not, I don't have so many close-up of this work, but in my practice, I also work with a lot of different materials and aesthetic perspectives, and I draw on knowledge from different historical traditions in visual art and also textile crafts, and then particularly with weaving. And I also have had like a focus on this historical thing where it's mostly female artists that's been working with textiles and trying to get into the history and also maybe in a political way using weaving as like an artistic medium in contemporary art today. Yeah, that was the overall I was thinking about saying. I think I don't know if you want me to talk more about the pictures that I sent or if we should go to the next.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to speak about anything specifically, that's great. But otherwise, we can move on, whatever you feel comfortable.
Yeah, I just thought it would be like novel introduction to my practice.
Okay, great. So, Lucía, do you want to take it from there?
Sure. Buenos días a todos. Buenas tardes. I'm from Peru and I speak Spanish, but today I am going to be participating using English as my form. I just want to, well, thank you so much for the organizers for extending me the invitation to participate, and for my colleagues with whom I'm sharing today's session as well. I do have to say that I am a critical case of all but dissertation doctorate student. So I do have doctorate studies, but I have not yet received my title. But I do come I do approach my work, and my background is very, very embedded in, I would say, multidisciplinary and an interdisciplinary approach. I have, as you mentioned, a background both in social science and in design. And through both lenses is from which I approach all of my work, whether this is in the context of formal education, because I do teach and formal education. With formal, I mean a classroom and participate in different institutions. But I do teach informal structures, and I do believe greatly in materials and design processes and art forms and aesthetics as channels for to communicate and to inform. And to share and to express ideas and create knowledge of different forms. So that's in fact the majority of the works that I develop that are outside of, let's say, formal academic work, have to do with creating an opportunity to trigger both the viewers and or in this case the viewers, the audience, or the users' perspective of different issues. For me, some of the issues that I have been focusing on have mainly to do in a broad way as well with health. I do have a personal interest in addressing different issues related to public health, and within public health, mainly orienting these projects towards sexual and reproductive health rights, biopolitics, and the mechanisms that I use are to communicate this and to address these projects are diverse. I do use the support of textiles in very different forms. I do try to relate my works in human body forms and structures. For me, the possibility of let's say the physical object that is materialized from these projects, for me, it does exist in a human body form. And I use that a lot in the way in which I try to communicate the different works that I develop. What you're looking at right now are some images of different projects. I use a variety of techniques. I am a tapestry weaver. I use tapestry weaving a lot. I like it. But beyond liking it, I do find in handcrafted processes as well a series of layers that I believe help and add and enrich the possibilities of a materialized object and a tactical one as well, and a performative one to actually impact in the different, let's say, issues or conversations that I want to promote with the work. And that's it.
Wonderful. Thank you, Lucia.
You're welcome.
Victoria, do you want to go next?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you to the organizers and everyone else for putting this together. I'm really happy to be here. And it's so cool to hear more about Anne and Lucia's practices. People who I already knew, but it's just cool to hear you guys introduce yourselves. So thanks for us being together. So my name is Victoria. I'm a New York-based artist, and I work primarily with textiles. I'm a weaver like the others. I use a floor loom, an 8-harness jack floor loom. I'm also a spinner. I use a wheel and a spindle, and a dyer, using both natural and synthetic dye processes. And in addition to those craft and handmade materials, I'm also using some kind of surprising intersections. So here's a photo of a piece called Computer 1.0 that I create in collaboration with my partner. And we have a design studio, and we make these pieces. They're hand woven, and we're moving a series of liquid and air through them. I guess this photo doesn't really show that the kinetic notion of it, but you can always check out more images on my website or videos. But anyway, the piece itself, the pattern moves because the surface itself is changing. So I'm using technology like this, fluid dynamics. I'm also using lots of e-textile techniques, soft speakers, soft circuits. I've been also using some soft heaters to make some materials that can change temperature. And then in addition to using those modern technologies, I'm also interested in incorporating some sort of performative and social practice applications in my work. And I am an educator. I'm an adjunct at both two universities here in New York. And for me, teaching is really a form of being an artist too. Teaching is a practice of art, and getting to engage with students and have dialogues and inspire new creations is just as important to me as my practice is sitting at my loom and making objects. Here's an image, a couple of images of a show that I had in Queens, New York last year, which was actually curated by our beloved Carolina Arevalo, who's one of the organizers. So I made sure to include those photos because we got to work together on that exhibition. So you can see these large scale installations that I'm making where everything is hand woven and dyed. And in a lot of cases, the yarn is hand spun too. Conceptually, I'm interested in exploring borders and the ways that people have communicated or not communicated throughout history, and in particular, how the internet and modern technology has changed what a border can be, where, throughout most of human history, we were separated by geography or by geology, we could say, by mountain ranges, by deserts, by oceans. Now we continue to be separated, but we're more so connected. And I think craft is just the obvious place for us to start that kind of discussion because it's so much connected to collaboration. And now we live in a world where the internet, here I can see there's 202 participants and we're from all around the world and we can be in dialogue together because of technology and we're all interested in craft. To me, that's just like the coolest thing in the world, that we can all be knitting or weaving and doing our handmade stuff, but together because of modern technology. So maybe I'm rambling, but these are a lot of the things that inspire me. And I'm looking forward to some new projects ahead where I can continue exploring both conceptually and from a materiality standpoint, the intersection of textiles and technology.
Great. Well, thank you, you guys. Wonderful. So I think we'd love to just dive right into our discussion. I just want to let those of you who are watching know that if you have any questions for the panelists, you're welcome to put them in the chat. And I'll hopefully be keeping track of them so that at the end we can have the opportunity to, they can address any questions that you might have about their work or anything that they mentioned during our discussion. So just know that that is there for you. So I guess we'll just begin. I would love to start just with the idea of the textile historian, theorist, Victoria Mitchell. She wrote an essay entitled Textiles, Text, and Techne, which discusses the etymological links between text and textiles through the Latin word texere, which means to weave. She says the way in which textiles speak while also asserting language itself as a kind of making. How does the notion of language or communication in general kind of come into play into all of your work? Maybe we could start with Victoria.
Sure. Yeah, I love this question because I think there's so many answers. We could talk and provide so many interesting precedents where people from all around the world and throughout history have used textiles as a mode of communication. One of the things that's very striking to me, and I recently read that article, since you brought it into our conversation, I recommend anybody else who hasn't read it to check it out. Maybe we can share the details if anyone wants to read it. But anyway, this idea that textiles as an object have the ability to communicate something, but what we more often hear is the interpretation of that communication through someone who might have discovered that object or encountered it is a better word. We are historically more familiar with the people who have had the amplified voice to talk about the things that they've encountered. It's less often the craftsperson who made the object whose voice gets to be heard. It's the person who interpreted that object. So to me, this is very interesting. There's so many ways that we can explore textiles and craft, and they show up in so many different industries, but often the authors are not associated with those objects. So I'm really inspired by that and investigating the people that are making these things in the materials. It's a big part of my practice as a teacher. But from a conceptual standpoint, in my artwork, I always try to find ways to communicate with my materials too, and embedding meaning and using different kinds of coded language. There's so many rich precedents that we could look to of people who have used textiles to communicate.
Great. Lucia or Anne-Sophie, do you guys have anything to add to that, or?
Yeah, well, I was just thinking about Annie Albers, who was working with textile and text in her practice, and using text to make patterns, and I really like that work, her work, and I find that very inspiring, and also in a way of understanding how we communicate with each other, and through language, and then also physically through textiles. Yeah.
Great.
I would add something. I think pulling a little bit from what also Victoria mentioned, like there's this what I find to be an important tension also between, textiles, fibers, techniques, and of course the ways in which we approach that from not only from the location from which we are looking at, but from the context in which we are also using some of traditional techniques and or studying them and or interpreting them, or reinterpreting them within the context of our own works. If we are intentional about that, if we want those techniques, for example, to speak about a specific type of work that we want to achieve as well. And I find that there's always an important tension to not lose in terms of the limits between interpretation, or I don't know if the limits, but like how to place one's work in the context of appropriating and not appropriating, preserving, promoting, developing further, collaborating. And there are a lot of thinking about also the verticality of, for example, using language explicitly in the context of one's work when language is not necessarily or might not necessarily be, and with language specifically addressing text or language in the context of a specific origin, when that is not conceived as something that might reach out to a larger audience, if that's something that you don't want to use or you want to use intentionally. So kind of like when thinking about one's own practice, when thinking about the multiple conceptual layers of not only the use of techniques, but the topics and or the materials and the processes that we're involved in, what are these multiple tensions that we deal with on an everyday basis, and what do we do about those as well?
Yeah, she does discuss kind of the hierarchy of senses too in the article, and the way in which sight is somehow privileged over the sensuality of textiles, which is such a vital part of its materiality and its mode of making, but also of communicating. So I just wonder, how do you guys incorporate the idea of touch into your work? I mean, Lucia, I know you make wearable garments, but I don't know if you all want to just speak to that a little bit, because I think that would be very interesting to hear. Whoever wants to start.
You said Lucia, so I'm going to jump in. I do. I mean, I was going to say, for me, I mean, yes, it is the tactile experience. It's about touch, but feeling, broadly speaking, perception from senses that involve feeling weight as well. for example, when I'm creating with the idea of a human body as the interface or as that entity that's going to articulate this other body form that I'm creating, that for me is a challenge of thinking about, okay, how can I communicate and try to articulate what I'm interpreting through weight, volume, and surface, and many other I would say sensitive forms that I would like to use intentionally in order to, in my case at least, to impact in someone's perceptions of an issue that it's being represented through this materialized body form.
For me, the sense of touch comes very strongly into play as the maker when we're working with craft materials, in particular weavers, right? Like when we're making cloth, we have this intimate touch with every single millimeter of thread that finds its way in our loom. And it's not just once, we're constantly touching. And for me as a spinner, I'm also there when the yarn is being produced. And as a dyer, my hands are there, and it's so much a handmade thing because of all the times that the hand was touching it. I think this is more often true in the craft media, not just textiles, than maybe some other fine arts or design materials where your hand does not have to be with every material. When I show my work, most of it is, not all, but most of it is not presented in a way where you would feel inclined to touch it. It's in like an arts space, and somehow we've been conditioned not to touch art. However, I have noticed when I'm, let's say, in a group exhibition with non-textile artists and textile artists, people are touching my work way more often than they're touching the oil painting or the bronze sculpture. And while I can feel frustrated because sometimes it's very delicate, I also smile in a sense because we are so familiar with this material that we don't hesitate to touch it. It's an extension of our bodies in this really beautiful way. So we don't have that same filter as we do with other materials. We feel safe with it, and it can help us really connect to our own identities much more quickly than other materials. And I think that's really magical about fibers.
Totally.
Yeah, I would say like the same you said, Victoria, with the like that people have this immediate physical response to textile, and I think I really like to work with that in my installations, and I actually often hang my textiles so they're like going down from the ceiling down to the floor, and I really like that people connect to it in a physical way. And I don't have a big problem with people touching it because most people are quite respectful, but there is this, as you say, kind of hierarchy in like if there's a painting or a sculpture and then a textiles, because people just immediately think that they are allowed to touch it, which is quite interesting to work with this part of it. With the tactile, and also that there is this when I weave on I have my shaft loom here. I made I also sent a photo of my late work. It's a really big piece I made on this, and I also used a lot of different materials in that piece, like plastic and plastic bags that I cut up, and I used organic fibers and I don't know, bast, it's called that in Danish. And so I really like that people, when they get close to it, that they see these materials that they know and are used to have in their hands.
Cool. Yeah, I think you all kind of did touch upon, Victoria did use the word also identity, which is a part of this conversation, but the way in which, the intimacy of fiber, it's something that people are so familiar with. They think it's almost an extension of themselves, that they are more comfortable than they would be touching fiber rather than, art of another material. I just wonder how identity comes into play in your work, whether it's through a statement, a political statement you're making, whether it's through just the exploring different materials or technologies, kind of how you put forward or imbue your work with a sense of self or a sense of maybe somebody else's identity. But if you want to speak to that.
Yeah.
And Victoria.
I can go.
Okay. Sorry.
Yeah, it's funny how we're the Zoom environment. Anyway, yeah, identity is not the first word I would use to describe my work. Like if you said, give me 3 words to describe your work, it wouldn't be one of them. But that being said, it's certainly a big part of my work. One of the most prominent driving forces for me as a maker is to be a storyteller. And I think creating an art object is another way of starting a dialogue and inviting people to share that conversation with you. And I think that our identities are shaped by the stories of the people around us, whether we know those stories or not. So it's just going through the process of being more aware and more connected to the stories that make up our cultures is really important. Like we were kind of saying earlier, there's some stories are shared, some stories aren't. And there's some people culturally who get to decide which stories are told. But as artists, I think being an artist is political no matter what, because we're putting stories out there and we're asking people to talk about them with us. So I guess when I think about my identity as an artist, I feel like a facilitator, inviting people to examine things a little bit more closely than they might have otherwise, looking at their materials and posing questions. And again, this is a big reason why I'm an educator, because I just so much love to artfully inspire a dialogue and hopefully inspire people to be better humans or more considerate humans.
Yeah, well, I would say that personally, for me, I grew up with a mother who was doing a lot of textile crafts. So it's been like a big part of my identity. So it was kind of a natural way for me to express my artistic self through textile, but it's not important for me that people see that it's like personal pieces, but it was just a natural extension for me to work with textiles. But I would say I have been working with this idea of the female in connection to textiles, which is also, of course, something I can relate to because I'm a woman myself. And I don't know, I just get mostly inspired by female artists. I don't know, it just came to me like just some years ago that mostly I look at female artists, and I don't know why, but in a way I just connect more to their pieces, especially textile art.
I don't know if you guys want to divulge a little bit about your process, kind of how you come up with ideas for new work, what inspires you, but maybe just walk us through a little bit of that process and your practice.
I can start and tie it with the previous question, because I do explicitly talk about my work coming out of an interpretation of how I deal with politics in different dimensions of life. So when I do think about my own identity in the context of the work is the lens from which I start everything. It varies in terms of the project and the approach from the context that I'm standing at. But one very concrete thing that happened to me, I am from Peru. I lived in Peru. I'm from Lima, the capital. I lived there the majority of my life. Almost 11 years ago, I moved to North America. And I say North America because I've been in Canada and in the United States. But it wasn't until I think probably 15, that I started to work in a specific series of projects that for me were primarily addressing issues that related to my own identity and experience as a person migrating from one place to the other, and thinking about, for example, sexual and reproductive health rights in that context, in a context that I did not feel was a place where I was from, and that I was starting to understand how I belonged to, although I had been there for a long time here, actually. I think it's an ongoing process about, I'm not sure if the word is reclaiming, but redefining or understanding one's role, and in my case, my role and my identity within a specific context. Affiliation, for example, in the context of the institutions that I work with, how I feel or not related to the moral and vision of that space. How does that affect the work that I do? And I'm going back to the political aspect of that. And what I want to do in some projects is definitely using those tensions as well to try to generate work that hopefully can trigger someone else's perspective of things beyond my own. Sorry, I forgot your following question.
Just kind of the process of, or how you come up with new ideas for work.
Oh, right. Oh, well, yeah. Pretty much related to that. I was going to say frustration was at the beginning a great motivator, I think, for many people as well. I personally hate the word inspire. It's a very tricky word. But I do believe that a reaction, perhaps for me, might be more, if I were to find a couple of words that help or that intervene in my design and making processes, reaction is for sure one, whatever that means for anyone. But for me, it means a lot of things too. I think it's as many of us who are participating, not just as panelists, but the participants of the session as well, just creating might mean different things in different forms, and it comes in different formulas that we sort of typify and identify across our careers as well, right? And even the now, and I've been thinking a lot because I've been asked these questions since the pandemic, since we are experiencing the pandemic, and what and how has that affected even the creative process? Like, one main question that I'm asking even my students right now, and I ask myself all the time, this, especially since the last 6 months, is, do you feel you have the emotional space to create? And what does that mean to you? How do you relate to your identity now? How can you even think about vision or perspective when there's so much uncertainty in the world, right? So, I mean, not that I have an answer, but the ability or the possibility to question one's processes, at least for me, is very important when it comes to thinking about making any type of project, right? And then whether I use one technique or the other, whether I use one material or not, those for me come as part of this sort of like process of internal process of thinking, feeling, and then interpreting how could I try to articulate that so that it's not just my own individual experience, and trying to place that in a social context of some form.
Great.
An important part of my process is collaboration. So I've found that the objects or the projects that I've done with other people are often the more the ones that I feel the most excited about, and using collaboration kind of like it's a material, seeing the ways that you can generate a concept or an inspiration, or, a reaction when it is born from multiple minds, and the ways that they can overlap in different stories and backgrounds. of course, like I've mentioned, I'm in the studio by myself a lot, spinning, weaving, dyeing, etc. But I think that the meat of my practice is in the collaboration. And I'm talking about it so far in terms of working with other people, but I think collaboration can come in the form of doing research, maybe just experiments with materials can be a collaboration between materials that are unexpected. I try to spend as much time as I can mining from the things around me, while of course being cautious about appropriation and those kinds of things and crediting inspiration. But I guess what I mean is just kind of having that human to human experience can be so stimulating. And I've been lucky to work with people who are textile artists and people who are not, or maybe don't even identify as artists. The Computer 1.0 project, which we showed an image of earlier, I mentioned it's a collaboration with someone who's an electrical and coder. So he's not someone who's working with textiles at all, but we've still created something that's both coding and textile at the same time. I just think that's a really special thing that inspires me or drives me to keep working.
Great. And I know I said some questions from the audience at the end, but we do have a question because some of you have touched upon it. We are in the midst of a pandemic, and they're just wondering kind of what happens with your connection to your work or to your ability to collaborate when most things are now done virtually. So if you wouldn't mind kind of touching on how that's impacted your process or aspects of your practice, I think that would be helpful.
Yeah, I can start. Well, the pandemic just kind of really, I had like 2 exhibitions, and then it all got thrown up in the air, and I didn't know if anything was going to be, but it made me work more self-sufficient in my studio, and I really actually liked that I didn't have to, when I'm digital weaving, I'm borrowing like a loom because they're really expensive, but I really liked that I finally had a lot of time in my studio and using what I had in my studio, so that became kind of a framework for my latest piece. Yeah. So in that way, I think it was quite inspiring for me with these, when you look away from all the sad stuff that is happening. But I could close my door and I could focus on my work. So I really actually used the space and silence to work.
Lucia or Victoria, do you have any?
Yeah, I think Lucia, you go. Okay. Yeah, I think it's an interesting time. Like Anne said, I've also been trying my best to embrace these new circumstances because it's like the only thing that can keep you on the right track. But I also think it's an interesting opportunity for us to reflect on sort of the economics of being a craftsperson or being an artist. And I'm a part-time everything. And I also had some exhibitions that were canceled and, honorariums that went with them or grants that were also canceled or postponed. And so I think people all around the world really rely on the comfort and the excitement that they get from the materials and the experiences that people like us create. But financially, there's so little stability. So it can be hard in these times to keep up with it. So I've been personally trying to manage I really get so much personal fulfillment, and it's really meditation for me to keep working. But then how do I balance, my different projects so that I can make sure I'm taking care of my family and, my whole life. I don't think it's talked about enough. Unfortunately, there's not so much transparency in how these industries are operating and the people who are kind of behind the scenes.
Yeah, I for me also, my personal experience has been very different to Anne's as well. And I'm also a parent, so as you know, worldwide there's and I don't know if this is your case. Sorry, I'm not assuming like that, but in my case at least, as well, that has of course interfered in the ability not just to have time, which time is always a relative concept that I think we all struggle around, or the means to dedicate that time for that. But as I mentioned a couple of minutes ago, like the emotional space, which I think it's such a privilege right now, it's very much impacted by life and the idea of mortality. For me, and I turned 40 in a couple of weeks, so I'm like dealing a lot with that. What's the half of my life? Is this the end of my life? And what does that mean? What have I accomplished, et cetera, and all these existentialist questions, but that are, of course, very much embedded in, for me, at least right now, the impact of the work that I could potentially do whenever I am able to do it. Able in terms of, economic sustainability, time, and the mental, also space, emotional space to be able to create. I have been able to work on very concrete projects related to my design works. Trying to find mental space as well to organize and structure classes and to work in my role as a facilitator for educational processes in universities. But thinking forward, for example, for me, it is quite an opportunity to, in my own area of work, the narrative around public health is massively being used. I'm not going to say consume because I hate the word consume as well, but we are using narratives around public health, which is pretty much embedded in the things that I like working with. So I'm sure, and I'm not just sure, I am personally working around researching, trying as much as possible to address that in a formal way in the next iterations of works and projects as I move forward, having now the possibility to address public health issues in a much more concrete way than perhaps I used to do before. And whether I want or not for that to impact strategically in also the vision of other peoples and contexts in terms of values and hopefully development goals that are not just things that I aim for, but that hopefully can impact in a large scale and in a different setting as well. Yeah.
Great. Yeah, you all mentioned too just the notion of productivity, and I think during the pandemic, kind of, we've all had to reassess what it means to be productive or what it means to create, and what is deemed of value. So one of our audience members asked a great question that is, can handmade textile techniques generate a sustainable production system without the bias of capital? Can craft be used as a means of establishing a transdisciplinary community? I think that's a fantastic question. It's complex, but I'm not sure if you guys have any insight into, just from a social perspective, ideas of productivity and how that comes into play in your work or how it's been affected during the pandemic.
I don't know. Well, actually, I also have a small son. So through the pandemic, we've also been like, me and my boyfriend has been really like, then he had this, our son like for 2 hours and then I could work. So it was really being effective in 2 hours. And that was really good for me to try that. And yeah, and then the question was about like self-sufficiency, right?
Just, yeah, no, the idea of productivity and
yeah. But I think I was really productive in those 2 hours that I had a day. But I'm also aware of that I live in a very nice country when it comes to like public health, because the pandemic was never really out of control here in Denmark, and and we have like really a good social security system, and so in that way, and there wasn't really this overall panic like there were in so many other countries, and you can really see the difference in the countries throughout this pandemic. And I think that it was really clear that there's something that has to be changed in our society, and that the capital system is really can't really cope with this type of pandemic. But yeah, I'm a little bit afraid to see how the world reacts to this, but we'll see.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I definitely don't have an answer, though. I'm glad it's being asked, and maybe that's the starting point to finding an answer, is to asking a question. I think that there's a lot of potential, but it's just going to take so much buy-in from so many of us, and to really committing to not just supporting the DIY efforts in more than just participating, but giving all the resources that we have to give, but also encouraging and demanding from the bigger corporations that make that harder to change their ways too. There's so many trends in design and art and fashion to move towards a more equitable or sustainable future, but it can feel like it's quite far away. So I don't really know how we get there, but I hope that we are moving in that right direction.
There was kind of another question that was a piggybacking onto that is a great one. How do the panelists measure success in the current gallery and market-driven art space? It's a tough one.
That's a hard one too.
Smart questions.
Oh. Yeah, I don't know how to answer that.
These systems are not really set up for success for everybody. I mean, some people are wildly successful as they participate in these systems, but there are so many people who are unable to or just the systems are for some people barriers and not systems. And the art world and the way that craft and art intersect too is maybe another interesting way to look at this. But when I think about have I had a successful experience, it doesn't feel really very relevant to think about it from a financial point of view, even though I think that's what a lot of people mean when they use the word success.
Yeah, sorry.
Go ahead.
I'm also not sure if success I don't know if depends from what lens you are approaching it as well, like whether it's in terms of artwork and formal, for example, I don't know, the ability for your work to be collected in specific places or exhibited in specific places. I do believe, I think as it has been mentioned a little bit as well, like there's sort of like a pre-pandemic and whatever that's going to look like post-pandemic, not post necessarily, but like we've only been 6 months within the pandemic and its effects, and it is greatly affecting also the ability of audiences to participate in physical spaces, right? So how can one relate to that, and how are also, for example, cultural institutions relating to the idea of people in space in terms of public health as well? Like, how does that affect the possibility of an artist to share their work, et cetera, et cetera. So whether success is because of demand, of acquisition, publicity, promotion, I think, of course, that's going to be diversified. One thing that we talk a lot, at least in terms of, for example, the formal education, and when we talk with the students that are, for example, about to graduate and share their work, for now, we are relying greatly as well in digital forms to communicate our work, right? Whether this is a physical thing that we can take a picture to and show it, or to talk about it and to interpret, et cetera, et cetera. But the idea of using internet-based communication channels to promote work, to engage in collaboration, to know other realities, to work with this, to try to envision kind of like this shared spaces where we will redefine what success means in whatever context you define that as well.
Great. Yeah, another audience member asked a question that's related to that in terms of what your opinions are on the use of tools or applications such as Instagram or Facebook or other digital means to communicate your work and to make your work known, especially when I think sometimes textile work is so heavily dependent on, well, a lot of artwork in general, but being kind of in the space and interacting with the work on a physical plane rather than just seeing a photo of it through a screen. So I don't know if you guys have any specific opinions about that or how you use it in your own practice.
There's definitely some work that is thoughtful and important and beautiful that just does not translate in a photograph, and especially in a tiny screen. So I think it can be real detriment that we've kind of filtered out anything that doesn't look good on Instagram. It means that in general, we're just not seeing a whole category of stuff that would be so important to be a part of the conversation. That being said, Instagram and Facebook and these other things do allow more people to be in control of the way they're being perceived, I suppose. Like having a gallery or a PR person or something is really not as necessary as it might have been before, because we can take a bit of agency to share our work and give it the associations, like literally with a hashtag of our choice.
Interesting. Lucía or Sofie, do you guys have any input?
Yeah, well, I definitely use these sites like Instagram and Facebook in when I see exhibitions, because I don't live in the capital of Denmark. I don't live in Copenhagen, which is where most of the exhibitions are. So for me, I use it as for information and seeing exhibitions. And I also know that it's also important for myself to show what I do on Instagram or Facebook. But that said, I'm not really good at it, and I'm not really a PR person. I wouldn't say that. And when I studied at the Art Academy, we didn't learn anything about that stuff. We learned about making art and creating a practice, but then when we came out into the real world, we really were on our own and had to I really had to learn a lot of other skills than making art, I would say. But yeah, of course, there is this thing that when you work with textile, it really changes, and for me, I also work also site specific in the galleries or in this art space that I work in. So for many of my works, it's really important that the people get the whole experience to understand the art piece. But I don't know how to. I just think that's the way it's going to be. Yeah.
And then we do have a question for Lucía. Someone asks if you might be able to deepen your explanation of textile social design projects. So maybe just going into depth about a project you've done in the past that was socially informed in some way.
Sure. I mean, I think all of the projects that I try working on are socially informed, as the place where I try to start from has to do with my own interpretation of my role as citizen, and from that point on, I approach different topics. It depends on the project, whether it's framing the project from within a specific, for example, a social-driven problematic. If there's an opportunity to make connections and not to keep them on my own, but I mean to make connections between information organizations, to have some sort of platforms that could allow for more people to engage with, if not the topic, not the project itself, but the conversations that, in this case, a project might try to move forward. There's always an opportunity, at least I try to think about what are the opportunities of the projects to engage in multiple conversations that go beyond the material body form that I'm creating, whether this is something wearable or this is something that is going to be installed in a gallery, whether this is going to exist in the public space or not. What happens beyond that, which is a question that I continue to ask myself, but placing these conversations beyond the material object itself. And with that concretely, whether it's creating an online platform that informs or that shares information, for people to be able at least to have an additional place to connect with these different topics, whether it's bringing conversations, physically bringing conversations and trying to create a larger conversation around that from a verbal a conversation, for example, manifested in a panel, in a conference, in a video, in a podcast, in an interview, to allowing for the work to take very different forms. That, at least for me, in terms of, I would say, the use of different techniques that might help for the project to go beyond the object itself, and to locate these conversations in different places where when I try my best to address these issues, if they're embedded in the current social or political context in which of the place where I'm taking this to. I don't know if that answers the question, but that's sort of a little bit of what I try to work around. But social issues, of course, as we say, well, I mean, if we say political issues, social issues, like you can fit multiple things in life, or everything is social and political. So I personally do not like to distinguish my work as this is social and this is not social. And that's how I approach things in general. I am not an organization. I am an individual, and I understand my limitations as well. So whatever I aim to achieve, I try to be very aware of what I cannot, at least, and I know I identify now even more clear, a little bit more clearly, what are those areas that I am not sufficiently covering, for example, to allow for something that I am conceiving as social and political to get that type of impact that perhaps I would like for the work to have, that I'm not right now currently able to achieve as well.
Fantastic. We have some great questions. One is I guess it's kind of about the development of certain technologies and materials in textiles, and specifically synthetic fibers. How do you react to synthetic fibers versus natural ones? And do they evoke different dimensions or have a different sense of dimensionality in the work?
I use a mix of natural and synthetic materials. And maybe the most strong reason for that is because I think juxtaposing two things that we expect to be on opposite ends of a spectrum together helps us explore how other binaries might exist in our world. Like, what does the word natural connote for us, and synthetic? At least in the country that I live in, there's a foreigner and a native, or black or white, or man or woman. And culturally, we're so used to things being so different on a binary, but in actuality, those things are much more fluid, and there's much more space between the extremes. So I think of using natural and synthetic materials together as a way for us to explore that concept. Also, from a sustainability point of view, we tend to expect a natural thing to be good for us and a synthetic thing to be bad for us, but it's not always the case. Sometimes the natural processes can consume a lot of extra water, for example, whereas a synthetic process, if it's done correctly, can be safer. I wouldn't say that that's always the truth, of course, but I think it's important that we understand the nuances of these materials and designations before we necessarily jump to separating them so quickly. So these are all conversations that I think we can extract just from the materials that we use as artists.
Great. In that vein, this is another question. How do you all imagine textile art in the next 50 years? Where do you see it going?
Are we still alive? I mean, I would love to think that we are still alive, although honestly, I'm a pessimist, and I'm sorry because I'm angry. So I'm like, I think it's very clear. Sorry, Anne, that I was. But I'm very critical about how can we envision future, and with textile art. I don't know if in 50 years, I hope there are some conversations that perhaps we have now that are very current, even in terms of, for example, climate change and the environment and social justice, that it's not that they were never here before, but they're pretty much more in the open. And for many people, these conversations were not of interest before. And for some, that might be an opportunity to also, for example, relate to, maybe if, and this is not my case, but let's say I work with a community of people that live in a specific place, and if perhaps before I wasn't aware of the social economic context and the unjust systems in which many people used to live and have always lived in before, perhaps now this is a very good opportunity to try to think about that in the way in which we approach our own creative processes. Again, pulling the example of teaching, studying, or a learning process perspective from a formal institution, placing one's artwork and creative processes in a context where you can and you should talk about social justice and how that translates into, tradition and culture and health and economy and politics. Like, I think it's very important to bring that into the table. The conversation right now. So hopefully in 50 years, if we're still alive, then this is not going to be part of a course or a panel or a topic or someone's specialty, but hopefully this is embedded in the way in which we approach life, right? And ideally in a much more sustainable form. And with that, where we put in place our ability to elevate as well, and not just preserve humanity, but have a quality of life and dignity in the processes that we engage with.
Yeah.
Sorry, Victoria, you go.
Yeah, I really appreciate, Lucia, the way you articulated that. I think it's important that we think through those things. And to add, I think that textile is actually a part of so many other aspects of our life, but we don't recognize that quite yet. Lucia is giving us a great example of how it intersects with health. But as an artist, as an individual, that's not as easy to communicate to larger audiences. And textile shows up in so many other industries, not just shows up, but is actually like a driving force and inspiration and necessary to textiles themselves, the materials, the workers, the designers. So my hope for 50 years from now is that the way that textiles has always been integrated will be supported and accentuated, and the hands behind all of those contributions will be given more of a chance to inform the larger picture in the front line. So they're already informing things in such prominent ways, but we just don't take a close look at them.
Great. We have a few more questions. one of which, what do you think about man versus woman fiber art? So maybe just male versus female, or yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. Well, there is this thing that it's mostly like in Denmark, it's mostly females working with textile art, and I think that it is very, in a way, connected to the feminine. But I've been working with it. I think that I really like to work with the digital in this weaving, because in a way it has this more manly connotation or feelings to it. So in a way of like mixing it, I really wanted to work with that, and I mostly I thought more about it when I was studying, actually. Because I felt that there was this big gap between the male artist and the female artist, and I always thought that I had to when we had a discussion, that I really had to like come with these strong cases of why I was doing what I was doing, and I really couldn't see that there was so much different in a man painting on a canvas and me weaving, because I think it's the same amount of craft to it. Yeah. But I don't know. Yeah, I don't know that many male textile artists. So, yeah, actually.
Great. Well, I do think we can start to wrap it up, if you guys are okay with that. I don't know if you just want to briefly say I know there's a lot of uncertainty right now, but if you have any plans for the future, where your work is going, maybe so the audience could check you out. We can all see what's on the horizon for each of you. I don't know if you just want to briefly mention.
I'm gonna share my pessimist perspective of life. Personally, honestly, I don't know, and I think I'm okay about not having a concrete answer, because I have no idea. I mean, I'm very aware, as many of us here, that we're ultra privileged to even be sharing our work right now and having the time and space, as you said, and to even, you know, having the opportunity to talk about what we do, which is already huge. Whether we're able or not to create more new things or not. For me, at a personal level, it does, at least right now, I am thinking a lot about happiness and what that means to me, and how can I even try to achieve that with what I have, that I know I have right now, and with whatever else I can think about in the future. And I'm saying that and I almost want to cry. But thinking about your own sense of self in the context of your work, if you have the opportunity to do that, and the multiple layers of where you perform and how you impact in these different places. At least that's pretty much where I am right now, amongst other places, but trying to understand better the meaning and hopefully to align expectation with reality in a form that, of course, it not only affects my own personal life, but the life of my close ones. And we work as a trio right now. So it is very much embedded in, okay, how do we work around what we expect and what is that? And yeah, right now with very thinking a lot in what we have right now, and then how can that allow us to project future projects as well. But it is, for me at least, very much embedded in today. So yeah, there's a huge challenge about thinking about the future as well, and how that is going to be articulated then for me.
Yeah, I can identify with what you're saying too. And like what was said, we have an immense privilege to be able to be here and report on the things that we're planning, or the things that we have done. And I'm mixed between feeling grateful and also feeling called to action to try to help support the people around me with the privilege and the access that comes from that. From a more literal point of view, I have an exhibition that's actually opening today at Ars Electronica in Austria, which is like a digital arts and creative organization. And it will then that exhibition will travel to Brussels. So I don't know if we have anybody in those two countries, in those cities. But I unfortunately cannot accompany it. And it was a little tricky to give installation instructions through WhatsApp, especially for like very particular and nuanced technology installations. So that was a first for us. And yeah, besides that, I'm not sure I'm going to see what it's like to be working from home. I gave up my studio recently just to save on, costs and consolidate. And I'm embracing feeling what it's like to be working from home. And the tools around me or the things that I live amongst that I didn't realize were tools are kind of presenting themselves to me as tools, like things in the kitchen and, those little things that I never thought I could use to make art with are showing up. So I'm optimistic in the sense of seeing what can be possible with this new context.
Great. And Sofie?
Yeah, well, I'm opening a show on the 2nd of October. So I'm really just in my head, there's only like 2 weeks, I think, far ahead, because I'm a little bit stressed about it. But so that is where I am right now. And I'm going back to basic where I started. I'm doing some tapestry weavings that I'm exhibiting. So yeah, and of course I will share it on Instagram because I know that none of you can come and see it, but hopefully my family will come and see it. People that are close by. Yeah.
Great. Great. Well, I just want to thank our panelists, the audience, the organizers. This has been such a lovely conversation, and I'm so grateful that I got to speak with all of you.